The courtroom of Harrison County Superior Court had seen its share of drama. Pleas whispered through trembling lips, verdicts that shattered families, and silences heavier than any sentence ever spoken. But on that morning, the air felt different. It was charged, restless, as though the walls themselves sensed something irreversible was about to unfold. Detective Ethan Cross walked into the courtroom like a man who believed the world owed him obedience. His polished shoes echoed against the marble floor as he strode past the wooden benches, chin raised, lips curved into a smug half-smile. He didn't look at the spectators. He never did. To him, they were background noise. Civilians. People who needed men like him to keep order. His tailored gray suit hugged his broad shoulders. A badge clipped proudly to his belt like a medal earned in war. At 42, Ethan had built a reputation as one of the department's most aggressive detectives, effective, relentless, and utterly convinced of his own importance. Behind him, a young public defender shuffled nervously through case files. Ahead, at the center of the courtroom, sat Judge Malcolm Avery. Judge Avery was calm, composed, and unreadable. He was a black man in his early 60s, with silver threading through his close-cropped hair and deep-set eyes that carried a gravity most people noticed only after speaking too long. He wore his black robe with quiet dignity, hands folded neatly on the bench. No impatience, no visible emotion, just presence. Ethan barely acknowledged him. He took the witness stand with the confidence of someone who had testified dozens of times before. This was supposed to be routine, a suppression hearing involving evidence Ethan had personally recovered during a late-night raid. The prosecution's case leaned heavily on his testimony. He knew it, the DA knew it, and Ethan had never lost a suppression hearing in his career. Never. Judge Avery adjusted his glasses and looked down at the file. "Detective Cross," he said evenly, "you're aware you're under oath?" Ethan smirked. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, voice dripping with casual certainty. "Always am." The first few questions were procedural. Dates, times, locations. Ethan answered smoothly, confidently, occasionally glancing toward the jury box even though this was a pretrial hearing. He liked being seen, liked being heard. Then Judge Avery leaned forward slightly. "Detective," he said, "you testified that you entered the defendant's residence at 11:43 p.m., correct?" "That's correct." "And you did so without a warrant?" "Yes, sir. Exigent circumstances." Judge Avery nodded slowly. "Please explain those circumstances." Ethan exhaled, visibly annoyed. "We had reason to believe evidence would be destroyed if we waited. Drug cases move fast." The judge flipped a page. "Yet your report states you waited 12 minutes after arrival before entry." A flicker of irritation crossed Ethan's face. "Well, Your Honor," he said, leaning back slightly, "with all due respect, police work isn't always as neat as paperwork makes it look." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Avery's expression didn't change. 12 minutes is a significant amount of time, detective. Can you explain the discrepancy?" Ethan laughed softly. "I mean, Judge, no offense, but unless you've been in the field, it's hard to understand how these situations play out." The silence that followed was sharp. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. The public defender froze. Spectators leaned forward. Judge Avery lifted his eyes, meeting Ethan's gaze directly for the first time. "Are you suggesting," the judge said slowly, "that my question is invalid?" Ethan shrugged. "I'm suggesting that sometimes legal theory doesn't match real-world policing." Then he said it, the moment that would later replay on every news channel in the state. "I mean, let's be honest," Ethan continued, voice loud, confident, careless. "You sit up there reading files. I'm the one out there keeping the streets safe. Different worlds." A sharp intake of breath echoed from the gallery. Judge Avery's jaw tightened, just barely. But Ethan wasn't done. He tilted his head, smirk widening. "No disrespect, Your Honor," he added, the lie obvious. "But maybe if you understood how dangerous these neighborhoods are, you wouldn't question officers doing their jobs." Dangerous neighborhoods. The words hung in the air, heavy, coded, unmistakable. A black woman in the back row shook her head. A court clerk looked down at her desk. Even the bailiff stiffened. Judge Avery leaned back in his chair. fingers steepled. "Detective Cross," he said calmly, "this court requires respect." Ethan scoffed. "Respect goes both ways." The room froze. Ethan had crossed a line, one he didn't even see. He straightened, growing bolder. "I've been on the force 20 years. I've put away more criminals than I can count. And I don't need a lecture on procedure from someone who's never worn a badge." The prosecutor stood abruptly. "Your Honor." Judge Avery raised a hand, silencing him. His voice remained steady, almost gentle. "Detective," he said, "you will answer the questions posed to you." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Yes, sir," he muttered, then added under his breath, but still audible, "Power trip." That was it. Judge Avery's eyes hardened, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous, resolve. He looked down at the file again, flipping several pages slowly, deliberately. The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of paper seemed amplified. "Detective Cross," the judge said, "you stated under oath that exigent circumstances justified your entry. However, body camera footage shows no immediate threat, no sound of destruction, and no attempt to secure a warrant during that 12-minute interval." Ethan's smirk faltered just a fraction. "That footage doesn't show everything," he snapped. "Cameras miss context." Judge Avery nodded. "They do, but lies do not." A ripple of shock moved through the courtroom. Ethan leaned forward angrily. "Are you accusing me of lying, Judge?" Judge Avery met his stare, without blinking. "I am stating," he replied, "that your testimony conflicts with documented evidence." Ethan laughed again, louder this time, defiant. "Come on. This is ridiculous. Everyone knows how these hearings go. You slap us on the wrist, evidence gets in, and we move on." The arrogance was breathtaking. Judge Avery closed the file. "You seem very confident," he said quietly. Ethan smirked again. "I've earned it." For a long moment, the judge said nothing. Then he pressed a button on his bench. "Court is in recess," Judge Avery announced. 10 minutes. Gasps erupted. The prosecutor looked stunned. The defense attorney whispered urgently to his client. Ethan stepped down from the stand, shaking his head with a grin, whispering to a fellow officer seated behind him. "Old man's mad," he chuckled. "He'll cool off." Judge Avery stood, turned, and disappeared through the side door, his robe flowing behind him like a closing curtain. Ethan had no idea that behind that door, a decision was being finalized. A decision that would not only end this case, but unravel his entire life. And when court reconvened, nothing would ever be the same. When Judge Malcolm Avery stepped through the narrow door behind the bench, the courtroom noise faded into a distant hum. The hallway beyond was dimmer, quieter, a space reserved for reflection, not reaction. He removed his glasses slowly, resting them in the inner pocket of his robe, and paused. To anyone watching from the outside, his calm might have looked like restraint. In truth, it was control. Judge Avery walked down the corridor toward his chambers, each step measured, deliberate. His hands were steady, his breathing even. There was no storm on his face, no clenched jaw, no raised voice, no outward sign that anything extraordinary had just occurred. But inside him, memory stirred. Not anger, not humiliation. Memory. He entered his chambers and closed the door behind him. The room was modest. Oak shelves lined with legal volumes, framed certificates on the wall, a single photograph on the desk. In it, a younger Malcolm Avery stood in uniform, shoulder to shoulder with another officer, both of them smiling into the sun. He looked at that photograph now. 38 years earlier, Malcolm Avery had worn a badge too, before he was Your Honor, before the robe, before the bench, before he learned how power really worked. A soft knock sounded at the door. "Judge." It was Clerk Denise Holloway, her voice cautious. The prosecutor asked if 10 minutes. Judge Avery replied gently. "As stated." "Yes, sir." The footsteps retreated. Judge Avery sat behind his desk, folding his hands. On the surface, the recess had been granted for decorum. In reality, it was something else entirely. It was time. Across the hall, in a secured administrative office, a phone rang. Assistant Court Administrator Leon Watkins answered it, brow furrowing almost immediately. Yes, Judge, understood. I'll initiate the protocol. He hung up, staring at the receiver for a moment longer than necessary. Protocol. That word didn't get used often. Back in the courtroom, Detective Ethan Cross leaned against a wooden pillar, laughing quietly with two fellow officers. Told you, Ethan said smugly. These judges love flexing. Give him 10 minutes. He'll be back pretending nothing happened. One officer chuckled. You really went at him, man. Ethan shrugged. Someone had to remind him how the real world works. The second officer shifted uneasily. Still, you don't usually talk to judges like that. Ethan waved him off. I've dealt with worse. Trust me. What Ethan didn't notice was the way the bailiff avoided his eyes, or how the prosecutor whispered urgently into her phone, or how the public defender sat very still, watching the side door behind the bench like a man waiting for a storm. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Murmurs spread through the gallery. This isn't normal, someone whispered. Finally, the door behind the bench opened. Judge Avery returned, but he wasn't alone. Two men entered behind him, both in suits, both carrying leather folders. One wore a discreet lapel pin bearing the seal of the State Judicial Oversight Committee. The other had the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement, but not local. Ethan's smile faltered. The bailiff snapped to attention. All rise, he called. Everyone stood. Judge Avery took his seat, adjusted his robe, and looked out over the courtroom. Be seated. The air felt heavier now, thicker. Judge Avery's gaze settled on Detective Cross. Not sharp, not angry, just focused. Detective Cross, he said evenly. Before we proceed, I need to clarify something. Ethan straightened, forcing confidence back into his posture. Yes, Your Honor? Judge Avery gestured gently toward the two men seated behind the prosecution table. These individuals are representatives of the State Judicial Oversight Committee and Internal Affairs Division. A murmur rippled through the room. Ethan frowned. Why are they here? Judge Avery folded his hands. Because this court does not operate in isolation. He paused. And because today's testimony raised concerns that extend beyond this case. Ethan laughed nervously. This is overkill. Judge Avery's voice hardened just a shade. Detective, you will not interrupt the court. Silence snapped into place. Judge Avery continued. For the record, I will address your earlier remarks. Ethan crossed his arms. You implied, the judge said, that I lack understanding of police work, that I sit detached from reality, that my authority is theoretical. He leaned forward slightly. Is that an accurate summary? Ethan hesitated, then shrugged. If the shoe fits. A collective gasp. Judge Avery nodded slowly. Very well. He reached beneath the bench and placed a worn leather badge wall on the desk. Gasps turned into whispers. This badge, Judge Avery said calmly, belonged to Officer Malcolm Avery, Metropolitan Police Department, badge number 4172. Ethan's eyes widened. I served 16 years in uniform, the judge continued. Narcotics, violent crimes, internal affairs. The room went still. I wore a vest. I kicked down doors. I stood over crime scenes while blood dried on concrete. I buried partners. Ethan swallowed. I left the force, Judge Avery said, after uncovering corruption that cost me friends and nearly my life. He looked directly at Ethan now. So when you speak to me about the realities of policing, Detective Cross, understand this. I know them intimately. Ethan opened his mouth. Judge Avery raised a hand. I am not finished. He tapped the file in front of him. During my career, he said, I learned that arrogance is not strength. It is a warning sign. The judge turned his gaze to the two men behind him. Mr. Watkins, he said, please proceed. Leon Watkins stood. Detective Ethan Cross, he announced. Based on your sworn testimony today and prior documented incidents, this court has initiated a judicial referral to Internal Affairs for investigation into potential perjury, evidence tampering, and violation of civil rights. The words landed like a hammer. Ethan laughed, but there was panic in it now. This is insane. Watkins continued, unflinching. Additionally, The court has requested immediate review of Detective Cross's arrest history over the past 5 years. The prosecutor stood abruptly. Your Honor, this is highly unusual. Judge Avery looked at her calmly. What is unusual, he replied, is allowing misconduct to hide behind routine. He turned back to Ethan. Detective Cross, you have enjoyed the benefit of the doubt for a long time. Ethan shook his head. You can't do this. Judge Avery's voice dropped. I can, and I will. The judge pressed a button on his bench again. Bailiff. Yes, Your Honor. Please ask Detective Cross to remain seated. Ethan froze. Remain seated? He echoed. I'm not under arrest. Judge Avery's eyes never left him. Not yet. The room erupted into whispers. Ethan's world tilted, not violently, but subtly, like the moment before fall, when gravity shifts and balance becomes memory. Judge Avery leaned back, his voice returning to calm. Detective Cross, he said, you mistook silence for weakness. He paused. And you mistook this courtroom for a stage. The judge glanced briefly at the photograph still resting on his desk in chambers, of a man who once believed the badge alone made him untouchable. Court will now hear testimony from Internal Affairs, Judge Avery announced. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face, because for the first time in his career, he was no longer in control of the narrative, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of consequences. The first thing Detective Ethan Cross noticed was the sound. Not the whispers from the gallery, not the rustle of paperwork, not even the sharp echo of the judge's gavel as it struck the bench. It was the absence of noise from the people who used to protect him. The officers who had laughed for the minutes earlier now sat stiffly in their seats, eyes forward, hands folded. No nods, no smirks, no subtle gestures of reassurance. Just distance. That was when Ethan understood something fundamental had shifted. Judge Malcolm Avery sat motionless, watching as Captain Roland Pierce of Internal Affairs approached the witness stand. Pierce was a tall man with steel gray hair and a face worn by years of uncomfortable truths. He didn't look at Ethan as an enemy or friend. He looked at him as a file. Captain Pierce, Judge Avery said calmly, you may proceed. Pierce placed a thick folder on the stand. The sound it made when it hit the wood was heavy, final. Detective Ethan Cross, Pierce began, voice steady, has been under preliminary review by Internal Affairs for 11 months. The courtroom gasped. Ethan shot to his feet. That's a lie. Sit down, the bailiff barked. Ethan hesitated, then lowered himself back into his seat, heart pounding. Pierce continued. The review began following 3 civilian complaints alleging unlawful searches, falsified reports, and coercive interrogation tactics. Ethan laughed sharply. Baseless accusations. Every cop gets complaints. Not like these, Pierce replied. He opened the folder. Body camera footage in 2 cases shows Detective Cross entering residences without warrants and later modifying reports to justify entry. The judge's gavel struck once. Order. Pierce went on. In 4 cases, evidence logs show inconsistencies between seized items and courtroom exhibits. The prosecutor's face had gone pale. Ethan looked around desperately, searching for someone, anyone, to intervene. No one did. Judge Avery leaned forward. Captain Pierce, he said, why was Detective Cross still active? Pierce met the judge's eyes. Because his arrest record was defective. A murmur swept the room. High conviction rate, Pierce added carefully. And because supervisors believe the ends justified the means. Judge Avery's jaw tightened. Pierce turned another page. 2 weeks ago, he said, a sealed audit was completed. Ethan's chest tightened. That audit revealed a pattern of racial profiling, illegal asset seizures, and perjury under oath. The word perjury echoed like a gunshot. Ethan stood again, panic breaking through arrogance. This is a setup. You're using him, he pointed at Judge Avery, to make a statement. The courtroom erupted. Judge Avery slammed the gavel. Detective Cross, you will control yourself. Ethan's voice cracked. You're destroying my career. Judge Avery's reply was quiet. No, Detective. Your choices did that. Pierce cleared his throat. Based on today's sworn testimony, he said, Internal Affairs has found probable cause to escalate this review into a formal criminal investigation. The room felt smaller, colder. Pierce turned to the bailiff. With the court's permission, Judge Avery nodded once. Proceed. The bailiff approached Ethan. Ethan's breath came shallow now. You can't, Detective Ethan Cross, Pierce announced. You are being placed on administrative suspension, effective immediately. The words landed, but they weren't the ones that broke him. The bailiff extended his hand. Badge and service weapon. Ethan stared at the hand like it belonged to a stranger. Now, the bailiff said firmly. With trembling fingers, Ethan unclipped his badge. The metal felt heavier than it ever had. He placed it into the bailiff's palm, then slowly removed his firearm. The click of the holster echoed through the courtroom. Someone in the gallery began to cry softly. Pierce wasn't finished. Additionally, he said, based on evidence presented today, this court authorizes a material witness hold pending charges related to obstruction of justice and perjury. Ethan's knees weakened. Judge Avery spoke. Detective Cross, you mocked this court because you believed the system existed for you, not above you. He stood. But the law does not bow to arrogance. The judge nodded to the bailiff. Take him into custody. The words were simple. They were devastating. Metal cuffs closed around Ethan's wrists. The sound was sharp. Final. Ethan looked up at Judge Avery, eyes wild. You wanted this, he hissed. You set me up. Judge Avery's expression didn't change. No, he said. I waited. The gallery erupted. Shock, whispers, disbelief, as Ethan was led away. His gaze caught on the faces of people he'd once dismissed. A young black man whose case he'd testified in, now staring with quiet vindication. An elderly woman whose home he'd searched without cause, tears streaming down her face. Every ghost had a face now. Outside the courtroom, cameras waited. Flashes exploded as Ethan was escorted down the steps in handcuffs. The headline would write itself. Veteran detective arrested in open court. Inside, Judge Avery returned to his seat. Court is adjourned, he said calmly. The gavel fell. But the collapse had only begun, because what Ethan didn't yet understand was that losing his badge was the smallest consequence waiting for him. The sun had dipped low over Harrison County, painting the courthouse in shades of gold and fire. Yet for Detective Ethan Cross, there would be no warmth, no light. He sat alone in a holding cell, cuffs digging into his wrists, mind racing. Each second dragged, amplified by the humiliation of being stripped of his badge and authority in front of the very people he had once dismissed. The walls were cold, unforgiving, and the echoes of his own arrogance seemed louder than any shout from the courtroom. The world outside the courthouse had changed in an instant. News vans lined the streets, cameras flashing, reporters shouting into microphones. By the time he was let out of the holding cell for questioning, every major station in the state knew his name. Headline screamed, "Detective arrested in open court. Veteran officer faces charges of perjury and misconduct. Judge's past exposes corruption." For Ethan, it was surreal. This was not a scenario he had ever prepared for. He was a man accustomed to authority, to respect, to fear. Now, he was the object of scrutiny, ridicule, and legal jeopardy. Inside the interrogation room, Captain Roland Pierce sat across from him, calm, professional, and immovable. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee, a sterile environment designed to strip away pretense. "Detective Cross," Pierce began, his voice neutral but firm, "do you understand the gravity of the charges against you?" Ethan tried to muster defiance, but it faltered under the weight of reality. He shook his head, lips pressed tightly together. I didn't do anything wrong," he said, almost convinced himself as much as anyone else. Pierce leaned forward slightly. "You entered homes without warrants, falsified reports, and provided testimony you knew was misleading. These aren't minor procedural errors. They are crimes. You were sworn to uphold the law, detective. Do you see how serious this is?" Ethan swallowed. The first cracks of fear had begun to appear. I did what I thought was right. I protected people. I put criminals away. His voice faltered, each word weaker than the last. Pierce's eyes did not waver. The law is not about what you think is right, detective. It's about what is legal, ethical, and accountable. You are not above it. No one is. Meanwhile, the courtroom saga had ignited a firestorm across Harrison County. Citizens, activists, and colleagues debated, some in shock, others in reluctant admiration for Judge Avery's composure and decisive action. Headlines highlighted the judge's storied past, his years in law enforcement, his integrity, and his unwavering dedication to justice. Suddenly, Malcolm Avery wasn't just a judge. He was a symbol, a reminder that authority must be earned, not assumed, and that respect comes from accountability, not fear or intimidation. The public reaction was immediate. Civic organizations called for reforms within the police department. Community leaders demanded transparency and oversight. Veteran officers, some sympathetic to Ethan, acknowledged that even experience and tenure cannot justify misconduct. The narrative had shifted. Detective Cross, once untouchable, was now a cautionary tale. Ethan's world, which had once been built on confidence, fear, and control, collapsed in ways he hadn't imagined. His colleagues no longer greeted him with camaraderie, but with hesitation. Calls to testify in other cases were suspended. Internal reviews revealed decades of patterns, each uncovered layers stripping away what remained of his reputation. At home, he faced another reckoning. The phone calls from family and friends were fewer than expected. Many avoided him, unwilling to confront the reality that the man they admired or feared was now publicly disgraced. It was a bitter isolation, one that forced Ethan to confront himself in ways that bullets, arrests, and adrenaline never had. Meanwhile, Judge Avery returned to his chambers each evening, not with triumph, but with a quiet satisfaction born of justice served. He reviewed case files, ensured ongoing investigations were progressing, and silently acknowledged the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. For him, it was never about vengeance. It was about accountability. Every person who entered his courtroom, no matter their rank or reputation, was subject to the law. That principle was immutable. Months later, Ethan Cross faced formal charges. Internal Affairs compiled a comprehensive report detailing misconduct spanning several years. The district attorney pursued the case vigorously, determined that precedent, not personal reputation, would dictate outcomes. The trial was broadcast in the press, dissected in public forums, and discussed in academic circles as an example of systemic oversight and personal accountability. Ethan's career ended in disgrace, but it was also a beginning, albeit a harsh one. Stripped of authority and respect, he was forced into therapy, mandated training programs, and community service as part of a plea deal. Slowly, painfully, he began to understand the human cost of his arrogance. The lives affected by his illegal searches, his dishonesty, and his abuse of power weighed heavily on him. For the first time, he experienced empathy, not for the fear he had faced as a detective, but for the fear he had inflicted on others. Judge Avery, meanwhile, became a figure of integrity for a new generation. Young lawyers and officers studied his conduct, learning that strength lies not in domination, but in fairness and patience. Avery's calm decisiveness in the courtroom became legendary, a demonstration that justice is not about theatrics or intimidation, but about truth, responsibility, and moral courage. Ethan Cross would never forget the day his world collapsed. But in time, he learned a lesson many never do. That respect must be earned through humility, accountability, and adherence to the law. His fall became a cautionary story for those who believed themselves invincible, while Judge Avery's unwavering commitment to justice inspired countless others to uphold the principles they swore to protect. In the quiet of his chambers, long after the public attention faded, Avery reviewed the files one last time. He placed a hand on a photo of his younger self in uniform, smiling at a past that had shaped the man he had become. Justice had been served, not with vengeance, but with integrity. And in that, he found a measure of peace. The courtroom that day had not just witnessed a fall, it had witnessed the affirmation of accountability. And in that affirmation, the law had won.